Good evening, everyone. Hi. Uh, Good evening. Welcome to tonight's constitutional conversation. My name is Mark Storsley. I'm the executive director of the Constitutional Law Center. Normally standing in my place tonight is the director of the center, Michael McConnell. Unfortunately, Michael couldn't be here somewhat unexpectedly, so he asked me to fill in his place. Although he assured me that he's left you in very capable hands with our speaker tonight, who he said to me before this meeting he considers to be one of the sort of most interesting, up-and-coming constitutional scholars who's writing today. Without further ado, let me say a few words about our speaker for this evening. Josh Chafetz is a professor of law at Cornell Law School. His research interests are about structural con law, constitutional history, legislation, legislative procedure, and sort of generally speaking, the intersection of law and politics. He's the author of several books. The most recent one just coming out or has come out already?
About the next 2 weeks.
Okay, about the next 2 weeks, so you're timing this perfectly. Congress's Constitution, Legislative Authority, and the Separation of Powers. I'd say of all of Josh's achievements, his kind of most profound achievement might be writing articles about Congress's control of the president at just a moment when there's a lot of people who have newfound interest in that topic. Without further ado, or maybe with further ado, join me in welcoming Josh Chafetz.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to Mike McConnell. I'm sorry that he couldn't be here, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. So my topic is congressional checks on presidential power. So I thought I would just start out by maybe listing a few things that we know about the president. So first, and perhaps most obviously, the fact that he ascended to the presidency is itself a bit of a surprise. No one, apparently including him, actually anticipated that this was likely to happen. Second, he came into office without the ability to claim a significant amount of popular support. Indeed, a large number of politically engaged observers understand his presidency as rooted in a constitutional accident of sorts. Third, he came into office with, at best, lackluster support from the elites of his own party. There were significant suspicions about whether he had any fundamental adherence to his party's ideology. In fact, for significant portions of his life, he had publicly identified with the other major party. And his identification with his current party seems to have resulted at least as much from a personality-based fit of pique at a recent president of the other party as it does from any fundamental commitment to the ideology or policies of his current party. He only seemed to make it on the ticket in the first place after one more plausible candidate after another stumbled, withdrew, or imploded during the nominating process. And almost immediately upon taking office, he began to alienate large percentages of his co-partisans in Congress. Despite the fact that his party controls both houses of Congress, he got none of the usual trappings of a so-called honeymoon period. Indeed, as fissures within his party continue to deepen, facilitated by his personal unpopularity and lack of mandate, as well as policy disputes, things that ought to be easy in the opening days of an administration become increasingly difficult. Talk of impeachment is even in the air. Of course, it's highly unlikely that he'll be impeached, but the mere fact that it's being bandied about even semi-seriously at this early date is telling. And even if he manages to serve out his term, it's not at all clear that there'll be much to show for it at the end of the day. Now, as you probably guessed, the president I'm talking about, of course, is John Tyler, William Henry Harrison's vice president, who became president upon Harrison's death in 1841, a mere month after Harrison's inauguration as the first Whig president. Tyler had begun affiliating with the Whig Party in 1834, 1835, when being a Whig was more about opposition to Andrew Jackson than it was about adherence to any particular ideology or platform. And although the party, led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, would go on to develop a more coherent ideology in the next decade or so, largely rooted in Clay's American system, Tyler was never really on board, remaining at heart a dedicated old, which is to say Jeffersonian, Republican. 1840 was in fact the first year in which the Whig Party actually had a unified national ticket, and there was significant controversy over who would lead the ticket, with Harrison eventually emerging as a second-best consensus winner after the convention initially deadlocked between him, Henry Clay, and Winfield Scott. Tyler was an afterthought. Tyler was eventually selected as the running mate after basically everybody else who might have been plausible pulled out for one reason or another. Upon assuming the presidency, when Harrison died a mere month after his inauguration, Tyler was widely derided as his accidency. And he then set about thoroughly alienating his own party in Congress, vetoing more bills than any other antebellum president other than Jackson. This included vetoing 2 separate bills that would have rechartered a national bank, as well as 2 separate tariff bills. And the national bank and the tariff were both central elements of the Whig legislative agenda as it had developed under Clay's leadership. Within days of the second bank bill veto, Tyler's entire cabinet, with the exception of Secretary of State Daniel Webster, resigned, and the president was formally expelled from the Whig Party. He was expelled from his own party. And he served the rest of his term as a president without a party, and he was the first president who was unable to find a party to nominate him to run for re-election. In August of 1842, about 16 months into Tyler's presidency, John Quincy Adams chaired a House committee that returned an absolutely scathing report on Tyler's vetoes of various tariff bills. To give you just a small taste of the report, which goes on for pages, it insisted that measures among those deemed by the legislature of the Union indispensably necessary were prostrated, defeated, annulled by the weak and wavering obstinacy of one man, accidentally and not by will of the people, invested with that terrible power. Indeed, the committee majority expressed its view that impeachment was proper, but they stopped short of reporting out an impeachment resolution, instead reporting out a proposed constitutional amendment to allow veto overrides by bare majority. That is to say, to take that terrible power away from John Tyler. When Tyler replied to the veto message with a lengthy message of protest, the House resolved that the protest message itself was a breach of the privileges of the House. That's the equivalent of a finding of contempt of Parliament, a finding that had only been made at that point against one other president, once again, Andrew Jackson. What's more, Tyler had what can only be described as an abysmal record with appointments. To quote Michael Gerhardt, the Senate rejected 7 of his 20 cabinet nominations, the largest number of cabinet nominations ever made by a single president to be rejected by the Senate. In Tyler's last 2 years in office, the Senate blocked a majority of his nominations, including 4 cabinet and 2 minister nominations, and the Senate rejected 8 of his 9 Supreme Court nominations, the largest number of unsuccessful Supreme Court nominations ever made by a single president. Now, some of those numbers are actually inflated somewhat by Tyler's practice of renominating for the exact same position on the exact same day someone who had just been voted down on the Senate floor as a way of heightening the conflict with the Senate, presumably hoping that the Senate would take the opportunity to back down. The Senate, which, by the way, was controlled by the Whig Party for Tyler's entire presidency, declined to take the opportunity to back down. Now, none of this is to say that Tyler didn't accomplish anything. He was somewhat more successful in the realm of foreign policy and westward expansion. Nevertheless, his presidency, both at the time and today, was and is widely regarded an abject failure. If you look at the sort of polls that are taken of presidential historians, of sort of ranking the presidents, he almost always comes in right near the bottom. You know, Buchanan was worse, but that's about it. So obviously there are a lot of lessons we could take from the Tyler presidency, and of course a lot of ways in which it's disanalogous with the Trump presidency in its opening days. But there are also some striking similarities, and I think perhaps a few lessons that we might take away from it. And one of the central lessons that I take from the Tyler presidency is the contingency of the forms of partisanship. Partisanship isn't a set pattern of actions and interactions. It's instead simply the label we use to describe whatever it is that political actors are doing with respect to parties at any given time. Parties weren't any less important in the 1840s than they are today. Yet Americans in the 1840s were treated to the spectacle of a president being kicked out of his own party and then opposed by that party at every turn for the next 3+ years. Or put differently, what we're used to thinking of as the inevitable roles and forms of partisan contestation are in fact highly contingent and protean. So the standard line is that a president whose party also controls both houses of Congress, what's often called unified government, will be able to push through large amounts of policy change relatively quickly and with relatively little standing in the way. And this is sometimes true. So the 111th Congress, which met from 2009 to 2011, the first 2 years of the Obama administration, looked a lot like this standard picture, passing the Affordable Care Act, the Dodd-Frank bill, a massive fiscal stimulus, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and numerous other laws that actually would have been considered major if they'd come out of just about any other Congress. Laws like the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, the Fair Sentencing Act, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and I could go on significantly more as well. But of course, that wasn't how the Whigs behaved during the Tyler administration. Instead of working with the same party president, allowing him a role in shaping their agenda, they insisted that he get on board with their agenda. And when he didn't, they turned overtly confrontational, expelling him from the party. But we don't have to go all the way back to Tyler to find presidents having trouble with same-party Congresses. Consider the 109th Congress, which met from 2005 to 2007, with Republicans in control of both houses of Congress and Republican George W. Bush in the White House. Despite a major sustained push by the president, his signature issue, Social Security reform, to which he devoted over a fifth of the 2005 State of the Union address and then went on a lengthy national tour to promote, failed to even make it through the House of Representatives, much less the Senate. And of course, Bush's nomination of Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court was withdrawn after it became clear that she didn't have the unified support of the Republican caucus in the Senate. So what might explain this? Well, many things, obviously. In politics, there's always a lot going on, and I'm always deeply skeptical of anyone who claims to have a monocausal explanation. But one key factor here is the president's standing in the public sphere. So Tyler was, of course, in a weak position. He wasn't elected in his own right, and the first fight of his administration was actually over convincing people that they should call him the president instead of the acting president, which is what a lot of other people insisted on calling him throughout his administration. He lacked either a national or a partisan constituency, and he devoted relatively little effort to developing one. George W. Bush in 2005 might seem to be in a much stronger position. After all, he'd just been reelected, albeit by a narrow margin, and his party had kept control of both houses of Congress in the 2004 elections. But 2005 marked the beginning of a downturn in his public standing that would last for the remainder of his presidency. By April of that year, his polling numbers were as low as they'd been at any point in his presidency, and in the administration's widely panned response to Hurricane Katrina in late August of that year sent his polling still lower. Many Republicans in Congress could see the writing on the wall, and indeed, Democrats recaptured both houses of Congress in the 2006 midterm elections. In the political climate of 2005, then, it's hardly surprising that the president was unable to convince other Republican elites to follow his lead on contentious issues. By contrast, in 2009, Obama had just been elected in a landslide, and Democrats had significantly increased their margins in both chambers. Obama's popularity remained high for most of 2009 and into 2010. Even so, of course, you may remember, Democrats were crushed in the 2010 midterms. Okay, so what about the current president? Well, Trump, of course, comes into office having lost the popular vote by quite a bit. Additionally, the gap between his favorability rating just before the election and his vote totals suggests that a large number of people who voted for him did so reluctantly. He was opposed in the primaries by nearly the entirety of his party's elite, and he made relatively little effort to cozy up to them during the general election or indeed after he won. And his approval ratings have been substantially underwater since at least the second week of his presidency, normally the period in which one would expect them to be at a zenith. Perhaps most tellingly, to me at least, a recent Pew poll found that 55% of Republicans think that Republicans in Congress have no obligation to back Trump's policies if they disagree with him. That is to say, the Republican base has given its elected congressional leadership permission to challenge the president if it's so inclined. Or to put it differently, Trump's standing in the public sphere, I think, can fairly be described as abysmal. This, of course, doesn't guarantee that significant opposition to Trump would will pop up overnight, but it does suggest that the conditions for pushback are there. The conditions under which pushback might arise are present. So if the public conditions are indeed ripe for potential intra-party opposition, what might that look like? Well, first and most obviously, enough Republicans in Congress might oppose the president's legislative agenda so as to make it unpassable. I was always skeptical, to be honest, that Republican health care reform could get through the Senate, but I took it for granted that, of course, it would get through the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is the chamber, after all, that is built to allow the majority party leadership to more or less get what it wants through the chamber. So the repeated failures to get the American Health Care Act through the House of Representatives, we're now on, what, our third or fourth try, depending on how you count, are really, I think, quite shocking. What's more, from the moment they were released, Republican elites have been signaling deep hostility to the White House's budget proposals. The deal that was apparently agreed to last night to fund the government for the remainder of this fiscal year itself walks back a huge number of White House proposals, priorities, and preconditions. There are no sharp cuts to domestic spending, including no cuts to Planned Parenthood funding and only a 1% cut to the EPA budget. The White House is committed to continuing to make subsidy payments to insurers under the Affordable Care Act. And not only is no money appropriated to begin construction on a border wall, but the proposed legislation actually contains provisions that would prevent the use of other border security funds from being used to begin construction on a wall at all. Additionally, various aspects of the White House's tax reform proposals have attracted massive intra-party hostility as well. Now, these aren't peripheral elements of Trump's legislative agenda. They're among the issues that he campaigned on most vigorously and that he has talked about the most since he's been elected, especially the Affordable Care Act and the border wall. Second, sort of in addition to opposing him on legislation, Congress, and especially the Senate, can use its power over personnel. We saw the Whig Congresses use this power extensively against Tyler, denying him both the executive and the judicial appointees of his choosing. We can see it in another 19th century president without a party, Andrew Johnson, whose impeachment and near conviction largely centered around the question of who got to choose executive officers. Right? The impeachment of Johnson, most of the articles of impeachment deal with his violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which aimed to prevent him from firing Lincoln's cabinet members without Senate approval, and violations of a rider in the Army Appropriations Act, which essentially tried to make the military chain of command go through Ulysses S. Grant, whether Johnson wanted it to or not. Right? For violating those provisions, he was impeached and very nearly convicted. We also saw the use of the personnel power with George W. Bush's inability to put Harriet Miers on the Supreme Court, and even with Obama's inability to get people like Don Johnson, Goodwin Liu, and Debo Adigbile through Democrat-dominated Senates. Well, so far in the Trump administration, we've only seen one cabinet nominee go down. That was Andrew Puzder for labor. But we've also seen an administration that's been remarkably slow to staff up, especially at the sub-cabinet levels. So to the extent that Trump's popularity remains depressed, it will be, I think, interesting to see how much trouble he has getting his nominees confirmed, at least once he bothers to nominate them. In this vein, I should say, by choosing a mainstream conservative as his Supreme Court nominee, Trump made a very savvy move, one that paid off with McConnell's ability to keep the Republican caucus completely unified in the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch. Okay, so third sort of congressional tool, both houses of Congress have significant powers of investigation. Part of the congressional pushback against Tyler involved committee investigations and harshly condemnatory reports. And committee inquiries in the 20th century have had significant impacts as well, ranging from the Nye Committee in the 1930s, to the Watergate investigation by the House Judiciary Committee, to the Church Committee and the Iran-Contra investigation. Even when, as in the case of Iran-Contra, the investigation doesn't result in legislation or impeachment, it has nevertheless released to the public information that had the effect of significantly altering the balance of power between the branches. Well, it's still too soon to tell what form the current inquiries into Trump, and especially into Trump's ties with Russia, will take. But the March testimony of James Comey and Michael Rogers before the House Intelligence Committee certainly put the White House on the defensive in various ways. And Devin Nunes's closeness with the White House has led to his recusal from the House probe. Moreover, several Trump-skeptical Republicans serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And there may even be signs of increased activity from the heretofore relatively quiescent House Oversight Committee, with Chairman Jason Chafetz having, let's say, liberated himself from the constraints of seeking re-election. Relatedly, I think, to congressional investigatory powers, perhaps, is the power to release secret information under the at least partial protection of the Constitution's speech or debate clause. We tend to forget now that the Pentagon Papers were released in extensive, albeit redacted form, by Senator Mike Gravel, who read them into the record at a late-night subcommittee hearing at which he was not only the chair, but the only member in attendance. He then went back to his office and had his staff photocopy and hand out copies of the subcommittee record, which is to say the Pentagon Papers. This all happened about 12 hours before the Supreme Court ruled in New York Times v. United States. We tend to remember the Supreme Court as the hero in this episode, but regardless which way the Supreme Court case came out, the Pentagon Papers were already in the public record at that point. Nor is Gravel the only one to have released secret information relying on a speech or debate clause protection. To take just a few other examples, Representative Michael Harrington in 1973 leaked information about illegal CIA activities in Latin America, a disclosure that played a key role in the passage of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment in 1974, which significantly increased oversight over the intelligence communities, and facilitating the process that led to the Church and Pike committees later in the decade. The Church Committee, of course, released its highly influential report. The Pike Committee's report was ordered not to be released. It then leaked in its entirety. And those two committee reports in turn facilitated the creation of the intelligence committees in 1976 and 77, and the passage of the Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980. To take perhaps a more recent example, during the Bush II and Obama administrations, Democratic Senators Jay Rockefeller, Ron Wyden, and Mark Udall on several occasions made statements on the Senate floor indicating their discomfort with national security activities taken by the administration. In these cases, those senators alluded to but didn't reveal secret information, which then allowed what Seth Kramer has termed the ecosystem of transparency to kick into effect. So in some cases, investigative reporters from outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post picked up on the hints dropped by the senators and within a couple of weeks had managed to ferret out the information that they had alluded to. In other cases, groups like the ACLU filed FOIA requests and then subsequently lawsuits when those FOIA requests were denied that led to, again, at least partial disclosure of the information that the senators had brought to their attention with their speeches on the Senate floor. Of course, the speech or debate clause only prevents members from being punished in any other place for anything they might do on the floor. It doesn't prevent their own chamber from punishing them. And both chambers do have rules about disclosing secret information. Again, here, Trump's standing in the public sphere will be relevant. If Trump remains unpopular and a member has material in her possession that's truly damaging to him, hypothetically, let's say evidence of collusion between his campaign and Russian hackers, something like that, that member may gamble that a majority of her chamber won't punish her if she releases that information, and that, in fact, she can enhance her own public standing by doing so, the way that Gravel in the 70s, the way that Wyden and Udall in recent years have become folk heroes to large segments of the civil libertarian community. This will be all the more likely, of course, if Trump's unpopularity allows the Democrats to capture at least one House of Congress in the 2018 midterms. Finally, at the moment, perhaps the loudest sounds coming out of Congress are those of silence. Given that we're only just over 3 months into the administration, it's shocking how little members of his own party in Congress are willing to defend Trump publicly, perhaps with an eye towards campaign ads in those 2018 midterm elections. More common, it seems, are statements like the following: "I'm not going to comment on every tweet or comment that Trump makes." And that's House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mac Thornberry. Right? And it's not just a Republican who's making this statement, right? It's the chairman of an important committee in the House. That is to say, it's a member of Republican leadership who is saying things like that, right? Don't talk to me about the president. The president is never in a good shape if leadership of his own party in a House of Congress is telling you not to ask him about the president. So all of these are mechanisms by which pushback, including pushback of members of the president's own party, could manifest and could continue to manifest if Trump's standing in the public sphere remains depressed. Of course, all of this could change. If Trump's standing in the public sphere improves, Republican members of Congress will get on board with his agenda. They'll confirm his personnel, they'll drop investigations, they'll publicly vouch for him. But it's worth noting that there's a dialectical relationship here. Failure to implement proposed policies, or bad implementation of them, or investigations that turn up damaging material will help lower his standing in the public sphere, which will in turn increase the impetus to do more of precisely those things, that is, to take actions that have the effect of damaging him. So in that regard, any one piece of news about the Trump administration or about the Trump administration's interactions with other elite actors will be about more than just healthcare or the Russia investigation or taxes or whatever the issue in contention is. It will be more broadly about Trump's interactions with Congress and with other political elites going forward. Politics is inertial in that way. Once a political figure starts losing, he's likely to keep on losing, absent some sort of external shock to the system. But one thing I think is fairly clear, and this is the point that I want to conclude on and so we can get into a discussion about this, and that's that Trump can't rely on partisan allegiance alone to save his presidency. He's going to need to come up with something more significant than that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. We're going to take questions now, if you're willing. And I ask, if you have a question, please come down to the microphone so that the recording can capture your question. Thanks.
I think your categories are out of date. You keep on talking about popularity as if it's just in the aggregate. But the 30% of Trump, the Trump mob, the Trump supporters, they don't care about all this stuff. Like, they don't care if he's in the paid employ of the KGB. That only matters to the New York Times, the liberal gadflies, and a few of the country club Republicans like Paul Ryan. You can tell I'm a Trump supporter. And my opinions are typical. We don't care about those things. And even if it's 30% of the public that supports him, it's a solid 30%.
Right, but 30% doesn't win elections, right? So
It does,
what?
if you have the right gerrymandering. This time.
Well, not quite, right? So what happened in 2016 is what I think most political scientists would have told you was likely to happen, except that most political scientists, like most Americans, just couldn't believe that Trump was actually a real candidate. But if you hadn't told them Trump was the candidate, right, what most political scientists would tell you is, in the words of Dartmouth's Brendan Nyhan, partisanship is a hell of a drug, which is to say that almost all Republicans and Republican leaners will vote for the Republican nominee, just about whoever it is, and this election, I think, proved whoever it is. So there is a, these are the reluctant Trump voters, right? These are the people who told pollsters that they disapproved of him and yet nevertheless voted for him. But those people might choose to stay home. They might choose to stop identifying as Republicans. More plausibly, the Democratic-leaning groups might choose to increase their turnout in response to Trump. But the fact that, and we can get into sort of complicated questions of measurement here, but the fact that it seems like a large percentage of Trump's hardcore base has stuck with Trump is simply not enough for Trump to maintain a solid standing in the public sphere. Don't forget that at the point at which Nixon resigned, his polling was in the mid-30s, I think. Right? There's being in the 30s doesn't get you much.
You described a number of examples of non-cooperation between the current executive administration and Congress, a lack of progress in certain ways. My question is, to what extent is that less evidence of the unpopularity of Trump and more evidence of the disintegration of the Republican Party as an even partially unified entity? Even 15 years after John Tyler was president, the Whig Party disappeared and was replaced by the modern Republican Party. Are we really seeing something here that's evidence of disintegration of that party? In name only, they have this unitary government that we have, but is it really there? Or is it really a party that's so split now that isn't really one party anymore?
That's a great question. I guess I think a lot of what you say is right. But I'm not sure the initial framing, that I buy the initial framing, right? You said maybe it's not about Trump's unpopularity, but about fissures within the Republican Party. I think those are two different ways of describing the same phenomenon. That is to say, I think that President Rubio, President Romney, perhaps even President Cruz would have managed to get more significant elements of each of their agendas passed by Republican-dominated Congress at this point. I think the fissures in the Republican Party are being made manifest in a real inability to get things done, largely because there are a large number of members who have no allegiance to this president. I mean, parties are cartels, right? Their whole point, especially in the American system, where you're going to always have two fairly large tent parties, the whole point of the party apparatus is to force some of their members to vote against their ideology at least some of the time, right? It's to wrangle them, it's to keep them in line, it's to lower the transaction costs of putting together a majority. And the Republican Party under Trump has proven largely unable to do that, at least partly because a big part of the White House's job in recent decades has been to serve that wrangling function, that you can't just rely on the leadership in the chambers to do it, that the president has become such a sort of first mover in the legislative process that if you don't have both coherent proposals and a lot of head cracking coming out of the White House, you're unlikely to be able to move things through, and that, I think, is what we're seeing.
Thanks. This is a similar question to that one, in that I appreciate the comparison to the Tyler administration. Were the Whigs in Congress, were they able to maintain kind of a unified front, as you spoke about them briefly? It seemed like that, but it was a brief talk about them. And I have been a bit surprised that the current Congress hasn't seized some kind of legislative agenda. It seems like Trump presents kind of a unique moment for people who are interested in separation of powers from both parties to get together and act in a more unified way, not on party basis, but just on a separate branch basis.
So on the question about the Whigs, they did actually maintain a unified front throughout Tyler's presidency. As I said, they sort of continued passing and repassing these same bills, even as Tyler vetoed them. You got the things like the committee report authored by John Quincy Adams that passes the House by overwhelming majorities, as does the censure of Tyler. So they did manage to maintain that sort of unified front, which is why Tyler manages to get very little done during his presidency. As to what we might see out of the current Congress, I mean, I would caution that politics on this scale is slow moving, right? So it's only been 100 days. It feels like longer, but it's only been 100 days. And so I wouldn't expect to see members sort of overcoming deeply ingrained habits like partisanship and sort of having had the time to come up with any particular legislative agenda, right? So working together across party lines isn't a bill, right? You've got to come up with an issue that you think will actually attract bipartisan support. And then you've got to overcome certain habits that members have about not working across party lines. Now, I will say that even in Congresses that we tend to think of as unproductive, right? Even in Congresses where we tend to think, oh, they can't do anything because there's just partisanship runs so deep, right? There are still hundreds of bills that get passed. I think total of 20 bills, no more than that. 20-something bills have been passed by the current Congress. Most of them quite minor, right? One of them keeping the government open for 7 days. Several of them naming VA hospitals. A couple of bills dealing with NASA. But I think what that suggests, right, is that partisanship doesn't run so deep that members never work with each other, right? There are uncontroversial things that they do work across party lines on. But if the question is why haven't they sort of done something big, the question is what that thing would be, right? What's the shared goal that Democrats and Republicans in Congress have right now? And I think to the extent we can describe one as having emerged thus far, it's at least dulling the edges of some of Trump's own initiatives, right? So it seems clear that one shared goal that Democrats and a lot of Republicans have in Congress right now is not trying to build a wall on the southern border, right? And they've managed to prevent any steps from being taken towards that end. But anything, anything sort of more affirmative, anything that's not just a blocking maneuver, I think there'd have to be a thing there. There'd have to be something, and I'm not sure at this moment what that would be.
Thank you, Josh, for a great talk. A question for you about the relative balance of power between Congress and the presidents and how this has evolved over time. And my sense is there's two schools of thought. One is that the pendulum swings back and forth based on many of the factors that you talked about today in comparing the Tyler and the Trump presidencies. The other is that over time, especially in the 20th century and the 21st, that the nature of the United States and its role in world politics, the rise of the administrative state, the advent of television and media, have all given the president a leg up, such that Congress is kind of, in a way, secular way, diminished over time. What do you make of that? Where do you come out on that? And are there any aspects of the more kind of recent circumstances of our politics that you think might actually give Congress the upper hand, if any, in some ways?
So that's a great question. I tend to like to sort of disaggregate that big question and think about sort of specific mechanisms of executive power and of congressional power. So I think it is hard to dispute that the modern technologies of warfare and of intelligence gathering have increased presidential power in that regard, right? The ability to send troops around the world really quickly makes it much harder for Congress to check. That said, I will say that right, the national security state, the national security apparatus, the military is all of Congress's own creation, right? If we had a Congress, which is to say, if we had an American people that was truly interested in not allowing presidents to project American force around the world, there's some fairly simple things they could do, right? Starting with not building aircraft carriers, right? But once you've built those kinds of machines of war, right, then you've given the president a very powerful tool, and in the moment, it's actually very difficult to restrain him. So in foreign affairs, in warfighting, in intelligence, I think the president's power has definitely increased. When it comes to the administrative state, I think it's a much more complicated question because there's a significant amount of research suggesting that the current desires of at least some subset of Congress actually have a great deal of influence over the agencies of the administrative state, even when those congressional desires are at odds with the policy preferences of the president. Or to put it sort of a little bit more concretely, it turns out that members of, or the senior leadership of the agencies tend to listen very closely to what the members of the relevant appropriations subcommittees want them to do. And they tend to be very responsive to that for perhaps obvious reasons. So there are different mechanisms of potentially expanding executive power. And I think along some mechanisms, it clearly has expanded. In other ways, I'm much more skeptical.
How do you explain the current apathy against dealing with emoluments as well as the nepotism in the White House right now?
Partisanship. I mean, I think a lot of the so I'm actually agnostic on the question of whether there's technically been an emoluments clause violation, but I also think that's irrelevant. There's clearly a tremendous amount of questions about the sort of intermingling of Trump's use of state power with his personal financial empire, and I think that that is one of the areas where, if Trump's popularity remains depressed, I would expect to see significantly more investigative activity in that area. But the way I would explain it right now is that we're only 100 days in, and partisanship takes a lot of inertial effort to overcome. I mean, same thing. That those are the kinds of issues where, right? I mean, and I think you see it. If you think about the way the sort of Russia investigations have been proceeding so far, right? Those are in some sense a little bit easier for Republicans in Congress because they can start at the outside and work their way in, right? We're not attacking the new president of our own party. We're just wondering about what Michael Flynn did, right? And so you can sort of start the investigations outside, and then they may develop a sort of inertial force of their own and work their way in. But the problem with something like Trump's financial dealings or the nepotism issues is that there's no place to start except with Trump himself. And that is going to take a lot of effort by members of Congress to overcome. It's not a pleasant task to directly take on a president of your own party in that way.
I wonder if you'd offer some thoughts about the Electoral College, your general opinion of it, the history, how it's affected elections even in the 21st century, and the wisdom or the prospects for getting rid of it.
So I think the Electoral College is a disaster. Its original purpose was to protect the power of slaveholders. And I think the prospects of getting rid of it are very, very low. Right? To get rid of it, you need some kind of mechanism, either a constitutional amendment or something like the National Popular Vote Compact, and you need you need states to sign on in ways that disadvantage the party in control of those states, and that's unlikely to happen. Right? But I do think it's a terrible system.
Hi. The Constitution obviously didn't mention parties, and George Washington warned us against parties. Would you care to talk about how the split sovereignty between the states and the federal government devolved into the current state of partisanship?
Wait, so I'm a little confused about this. So there was a sort of federalism aspect at the end of the question that I'm not sure I quite got.
Well, the Constitution had split sovereignty between the states and the federal government. Parties were not mentioned in the Constitution.
Right.
George Washington warned against parties forming in the United States because it would lead to partisanship. The notion of state sovereignty seems to have been replaced by party sovereignty. Democrats versus Republicans, or Whigs versus Democratic Republicans, or whatever. So I'd be very interested in having you trace that devolution from state sovereignty to party sovereignty and the split sovereignty called for in the Constitution.
Well, okay, so I guess I'm not sure that I would agree with the premise that that somehow partisanship has replaced the political power of the states or something like that. The states are still incredibly important, incredibly powerful governmental entities in our system. Sorry, did you want to? But I mean, partisanship is a creature of the very late American partisanship, I should say, is a creature of the very late 18th, very early 19th century, and it's been with us basically ever since. I don't think it is in tension with our constitutional system the way certain scholars do, but I do think it has caused our system to work slightly differently than perhaps people in the 1780s and early 1790s were envisioning.
Well, perhaps a follow-on question with respect to the party's internal operations, and you know far more about it than I do, so I'm eager to hear your perspective. My sense is that the Democrats tend to walk in lockstep. When Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, we didn't have a lot of factions in the Democratic Party, to my knowledge, opposing her to the extent that we have Paul Ryan being opposed by the Tuesday Group and the Freedom Caucus. Would you care to comment on that, please?
Sure. So I'm not sure that's so much a Democrat versus Republican thing writ large. That's a sort of statement about the very specific intra-caucus dynamics of Democrats at one particular time and Republicans at another particular time. I mean, I think it's also worth remembering that throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, there was a group called the Blue Dog Democrats, the sort of conservative Democrats, who were often a thorn in the side of leadership that was a little bit to their left. It's inevitable that you're going to have divisions within the parties when you only have two parties. Good congressional leadership consists in keeping your caucus in line. And there are people who are better at that, there are people who are worse at that, and then there are people who are just given impossible situations. And it may be that what Boehner faced and what Ryan currently faces is an impossible situation, which is to say a party that is so internally polarized and where the members see where enough of the members see the status quo as preferable to allowing the other faction of their own party to get its way. At that point, there's nothing leadership really can do. But leadership, and I guess the other thing I will say is that a lot of this actually traces, or a lot of decline in the power of the party to corral its own members, I would say, actually traces back to 1994 and the contract with America that was the big platform that Republicans ran the congressional elections on in 94. The parts of it that were most successfully implemented were the parts that dealt with the rules of the House of Representatives itself. And in particular, there was an earmark ban in the contract with America that has been more or less in place ever since. If you ban earmarks, you make it impossible for leadership to buy off members. If you make it impossible for leadership to buy off members, you make compromise really, really hard. Right? It's a little bit easier to swallow voting for a bill that you may not like in its entirety if you can also get a new post office or a new highway in your district. Right? That's how coalitions are put together in a body like Congress. You take away that tool, it's much harder. So I would say part of the difficulty in both parties of wrangling, when they're in the majority, of wrangling their own members comes from the earmark ban.
Speaking of compromise, the 21st Century Cures Act was passed by both houses of Congress and signed by President Obama. How do you explain this bipartisanship in the midst of all this discussion about partisanship?
So I don't actually know what the 21st Century Cures Act is. Can you?
Yes, I do. It addresses the crisis in mental health that we have in this country, and it incorporated both a Senate bill and a House bill known as the Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act by a very partisan member of the House and several rather partisan members of the Senate. This seems to contradict the partisanship story that we've been listening to.
Well, partisanship is never totalizing, right? So, as I said a minute ago, Congress, every Congress in recent years has passed, well over 100 bills, right? If everybody just votes party line all the time, we wouldn't see that. So there are some things where it's possible to cobble together bipartisan majorities. There are some things that are either not particularly controversial, or where the controversy over them cuts across party lines in a way that allows for action on those issues. So you see it not just with the bill you're referring to, but all kinds of other things. So the patent reform bill that was passed in the second half of the first Obama term was another example of this. That was one where the coalition split both parties. You see it. There was the Microbeads Free Waters Act that passed that passed last Congress, right, which was an environmental bill that had significant bipartisan support. Partisanship is a motivating factor, but it's never the motivating. Nothing is the motivating factor. Legislators have a lot of different goals, a lot of different priorities, and sometimes those priorities will align in such a way that partisanship doesn't swamp other things.
Thank you.
I don't know whether this is a constitutional question or not, but your opinion I'm interested in. Don't you think that the reason that Trump is not appointing anything other than his cabinet members and the heads of the agencies is that this is his version of draining the swamp? In other words, he does not want there to be a big bureaucracy in the government. So what I want to know is, does the Senate or the House have any power over having him appoint these people, one, and two, is there something in the Constitution about that?
Well, so the two questions you asked are related. So the Congress can't formally force him to nominate people for positions. The positions were created by Congress, and Congress could abolish the positions. And if they are positions that require Senate confirmation, then obviously the Senate gets to decide whether or not to confirm anyone once he does nominate them. But there's no sort of straightforward way in which a House of Congress could force him to actually make a nomination. Now, I say there's no straightforward way because there are always levers that Congress can pull on, right? They can cut off funding for things he does care about unless he agrees to nominate members for things, or they can refuse to confirm people he does nominate until he nominates other people as well, right? So there are things it can threaten to do, but it can't just, there's no way that it can actually force nominations. What I will say to sort of the premise of the question, if Trump really thinks that the best way to shrink the bureaucracy is not to appoint people to the high-level positions, then he's very, very mistaken. Because, of course, there are only a couple thousand appointees at that level. That's not what the bureaucracy is. The bureaucracy is literally millions of people who work in civil service jobs below them. And by not appointing political leadership, what Trump is doing is giving more power to the career civil servants. And we've seen the effect of this. The agencies are slow-walking Trump's policies. So you may say, well, Trump hates the EPA, and so if he just doesn't, if he empties out the EPA, then environmental laws, environmental policy won't get made. Well, yes, but Trump needs to make environmental policy if he wants to roll back things he doesn't like, right? And if he wants to do that, he needs his people in place at the EPA, right? And you can do that again and again across all these different agencies. So if this is his way of trying to attack the administrative state, it's tactically poor.
I'm interested in the legislative filibuster. It seems to me that we've had 2 whacks at the filibuster so far to eliminate it. With the 3rd whack, then the House and the Senate Republicans can get back on board with their policy and let Trump launch a war at North Korea or whatever, build, you know. So I wonder if there's a situation where, you know, you have a stronger, more activated party in the legislature and a less interested president that is more appropriate, or is that what your example started with?
Well, so I think
may just not veto anything because it's not something he's very interested in. He's interested.
Right. So that was a theory I think that a lot of people had at the beginning of this presidency. Right. Was that effectively Paul Ryan would get to be prime minister, right, and that Congress would take care of domestic policy, and that Trump wasn't all that interested in policy specifics. That doesn't seem to be the way the White House has operated in the last 101 days, right? It seems to want certain very specific things, and it seems to be putting out specific policy proposals in a way that makes it much harder for Ryan to unify his caucus behind perhaps his policy proposals. I think the other thing that's coming in is it was always going to be incredibly difficult for the Republicans to do anything that would really look like a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. So by starting with that, they made it harder on themselves. But I think, you know, your picture was the sort of picture that a lot of people had in mind at the beginning of this administration. It hasn't quite played out that way. I do think it's likely that the legislative filibuster will be abolished within the next decade. I don't think it's likely to happen this Congress, just because it seems to me that so many Republican members, including the majority leader himself, seem to actually have a significant attachment to the legislative filibuster that will take some time to overcome. But I think they will overcome it, whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I think at some point when there is unified government, the legislative filibuster will go.
Hello, thank you. I'm interested in the president's understanding of his own powers and the way you think he's yielding them. In particular, we see the use of executive orders, like the ban, for example, or the executive power against sanctuary cities. And in those two, there are constitutional issues that are at stake, so that brings in the judiciary into the situation. So the president is trying to do something different than the previous president. He wants to do it fast. He issues these executive orders. And maybe Congress, so how can Congress first react to that, if it can, in that speed? Second is the fact that the judiciary is the last resort against those, especially when they are unconstitutional or there are constitutional questions behind them. What are the consequences of having those, of getting into more of those situations? And in particular, in the case of the ban, I remember the president talked about, he justified the ban. He read part of the Immigration Act, and he said how clear it was, and that he had the power to do it, and that was his communication with his supporters. But there is obviously a long list of precedents that that the judiciary used to provide constitutional interpretation. So on one side, we have a president that has very perhaps simple understanding of the Constitution, and there is the real interpretation of it that's in practice. How do you see the two working against each other, and how do you see the future evolving in that sense?
So that's a great suite of questions. So I guess one thing to start out with on this point about executive orders, right? So Trump has signed a lot of them. Most of the ones that Trump has signed don't have any effect directly in the world, don't purport to have any effect directly in the world. The standard use for executive orders, for the most part, is a directive to other parts of the executive branch to do certain things, to take certain things into consideration, things like that. So a lot of them don't actually purport to have any effect outside of the executive branch at all. Of the ones that do, they've immediately run into trouble with the judiciary. And I guess I would reframe it slightly. Instead of saying there's Trump's understanding of the Constitution and the real Constitution, I would say there's Trump's understanding of the Constitution and it's running into the judges' understanding of the Constitution. And the judges are, of course, political actors as well. And their understanding of the Constitution in this case is very much tied to their understanding of Donald Trump, which is to say that legal elites, like elites of most kinds, were very much against Trump, even including conservative and Republican legal elites. And so it's not surprising that they are looking more skeptically at Trump's executive actions than they might at executive actions of other presidents. Now, it's not to say they were exactly hospitable to a lot of Obama's executive actions, right? The United States versus Texas, for example, dealing with the DAPA program. It doesn't surprise me at all. And again, this goes back to something I talked about in the beginning. I think this is very much tied to Trump's standing in the public sphere. If Trump becomes wildly popular, the judges will also fall in line. Judges don't stand outside of politics. But Trump is not wildly popular, and the judges are part of, to use a sort of buzzword of the moment, right? They're part of the resistance, right? They don't see themselves that way, right? They think they're just neutrally applying law, but the way that seems neutral to them in any given context is necessarily colored by how they view the president. Right? And they have sort of doctrinal lines that they can filter it through. So in the context of the immigration ban, right, they say, well, this is an equal protection issue. Equal protection has to do with animus. Animus has to do with the mindset of the decision maker. Here there's only one decision maker. It's the president. We know about his mindset because of all the things he said on the campaign trail. There we go. Right? Now, that all makes sense, but there's a lot of other ways the courts could have reasoned in these cases. Right? The fact that they chose that way of reasoning is because they don't like the president and they don't like his policy. And to my mind, rightly so.
Okay, we're told that Congress writes the laws and the bills, and the Republicans control the House and the Senate, but they seem to lack some inertia. I heard today that the laws are really not written by our legislature, they're written over on K Street. And I was just wondering if that's the truth, what kind of people are we sending to Congress if this is true?
So it's always, when we say Congress writes the laws, right, of course what we mean is that the laws have to be passed by Congress. It's never been the case that Congress writes all of the laws, right? So when both Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of War Knox wrote a large number of the bills that were passed by the first Congress and the second Congress as well. Ever since Congress got staff starting in the mid-19th century, right, it's been the case that staff did a lot of the drafting. Today there's an office called the Office of Legislative Counsel, whose job it is to draft bills, and they're nonpartisan staff, and their goal is just to write the operative legislative language. It is also the case that it has always been true that there have been entities outside the government that have brought legislative language they want to see enacted to members of Congress and ask them to introduce it. That continues to be the case. That is one thing that lobbyists do for members of Congress, is bring them bills that they want to see drafted. Now, that doesn't mean that the bill that the lobbyists draft will ever get introduced. It doesn't even mean any language from it will get introduced. And it certainly doesn't mean that any bill that sort of finally passes both houses and gets signed by the president was drafted in that form by a lobbyist. Whether Congress is actually the one taking, quill to parchment, or whether they're serving more in an editorial role, that seems to me to be sort of, in some sense, less consequential than whether they actually are passing laws that they like or not, right? So it seems to me that if they're passing a law, it doesn't matter if they're passing a law that was drafted by a lobbyist, or if they're just writing the law themselves but doing it at the behest of a lobbyist. Those both seem equally bad to me. Likewise, if they're passing a law they really believe in, but it happens to have been drafted by a lobbyist because they passionately believe in environmentalism and the Sierra Club lobbyists brought them a draft bill, that doesn't seem like a big deal to me. any more than it would be if they drafted that bill themselves. I will say if we care about members drafting bills themselves, we really need to give them more staff. I'm serious. Members of Congress, the congressional staff has fallen precipitously over the last 20 years. At the same time that, of course, the size of the executive branch has grown. Polling consistently finds that Americans think that members of Congress have way more staff than they actually do. If we actually want, and staff, frankly, you're talking about staff for 535 members and a small number of committees. It's not actually that big an item of expense. If we want Congress to be more vigorous in any regard, I would strongly suggest supporting giving them more staff.
Getting back to the filibuster, it seems that some laws are subject to the filibuster and some aren't in some situations, which is hard for me to understand. Will the health care law definitely be subject to the filibuster?
Definitely, you can't say definitely. So the process by which it might avoid the filibuster is the process known as budget reconciliation. Budget reconciliation requires, as a first step, that what are called reconciliation instructions be written into the budget resolution that is in effect. That is the case. So there are instructions in the currently operative budget resolution that would allow a health care bill to be passed by bare majority through the Senate. But to comply with, to be passable under the reconciliation procedures, you have to pass a whole bunch of really complicated procedures known as the Byrd Rule, after Senator Robert Byrd. And among other things, all of the provisions have to have as their primary effect some change in net levels of outlays or intakes. That is to say, they have to be primarily budgetary in nature, and they can't increase the net deficit over a period greater than 10 years. That means that there's an awful lot of things that awful lot of healthcare-related things that you could not do in a reconciliation bill, and even a lot of the things that you could do, you'd have to phase out after 10 years. So it is definitely possible to write a bill that undoes some portions of the Affordable Care Act and pass it through reconciliation. It's not possible to get rid of the Affordable Care Act in its entirety through reconciliation, and it would be difficult to do it in a way that lasted for more than 10 years.
We are over time, but I want to, one more, very short. He promised me it'd be very short.
Very short. Can I coax you into a general statement, if possible? It's been a brilliant talk, and answers, thank you. I think I'm going to go away from your talk feeling much more optimistic or relieved that I think you believe that the autocratic instincts of this president are actually being controlled and will be controlled as we go forward. Is that the case?
I think many of them are currently being controlled. I think whether they will be controlled going forward depends on how popular those autocratic instincts are and how popular this president is. And I will say, one of the things I said at the very end of the talk was that politics is inertial, right? That if someone's doing badly, they tend to continue doing badly absent some exogenous shock, right? War is an exogenous shock, and presidents can start wars more or less unilaterally, right? So I don't want to leave you feeling too happy. But I do think that what I would say is 101 days in, so far, I think the institutions are holding, for what that's worth.
Okay, and on that note, thank you, Josh.